Well, finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Evan Smith, who's the CEO and co-founder of the Texas Tribune. Evan's nationally known for his insightful interviews of our leaders and his policy perspectives. Since it was launched in 2009, the Texas Tribune has won numerous honors, including 13 Edward R. Murrow Awards from the Radio Television Digital News Association. So Evan is going to moderate a discussion amongst our speakers. Please welcome Evan to the stage. Thank you, and now I'll ask the speakers to come out and sit in the order in which they spoke. And if you want to ask a question of the panelists for the end of the conversation, please do so at this website.
Thank you, Jay. Panelists, good evening, everybody. Good to be here with you. Fascinating conversation you all had with the audience. Your presentations were terrific and stimulating, and I think they suggest areas of exploration for us as we spend a few minutes talking about the future of Texas. And that really is the focus, because your presentations could be applicable to not just Texas, but to any state. We picked 2050 as an outbound guardrail, but we could be talking about 2030 or 2070. But let's stay for the purpose of this discussion with Texas in 2050. The universe that I live in, we think about policy and politics and the intersection of those things, and there were really three drivers for the future of this state. And they were touched on to some degree by President Fenvis's remarks and your own. Their population growth, urbanization, and demographic change. And I want to talk about those three as specific drivers for the future of Texas. Michael, you know that we have about 28 million people in the state of Texas today. The state demographer predicts that by 2050, our outbound guardrail, we're going to have 54 million Texans. We're going to double the population of Texas between now and 2050. Basically 12 pounds of rice in a 6-pound bag.
Right.
But if you think about it, right now we're kind of like 6 pounds of rice in a 4-pound bag. We're already straining to fit all those. What are we going to do? We're not going to annex Oklahoma, God forbid, right? We're going to stay. We're going to stay within the same footprint, but we're going to double the population. What's that going to mean for the future of Texas?
We hope they don't all live off of Mopac, right? So this is the key.
Right.
Although
you'd be forgiven for thinking that they do now. Right?
Perhaps that's possible.
So what do we do about? How do you double the population within the same state?
So I think for me, the challenge often shows up as resource management. These are people who want the same quality of life we have in Texas, which is access to freedom to move around in a car and good industry and all these things. And these are all very energy intensive. And Texas is a very energy consumptive state. We're the biggest energy consumer of all the states by far.
Right.
And so if you take a typical American, we consume another 60% energy per person on top of a typical American. And so if we double the population and those Texans consume like Texans today, then we're going to have a lot of water and a lot of land and a lot of energy that's going to be made available. So we have to think about efficiency and conservation and better ways to achieve those desired end goods and services without using as much impact to enable that quality of life. I think it's not going to be the same approach we used for the last 70 years. It's going to have to be something more. And it can't be as many units of energy per person or as many gallons of water per person or as many acres per person. We have to be a little more dense. Urbanization will be part of it, so that opens up opportunities for efficiency. We're going to have to be a lot more lean on that because we want the high quality life, and we don't have a right to tell those future Texans that they can't have the good life. They want the good life as well.
Well, Katharine, to that point, the future Texans, the ones who are not here now, some will be born, but many will come if the trend of the last 25 years holds. They'll come for the things about Texas that they hear are so great. And they'll then have a reason to ask whether the way that they were lured here ultimately makes. We're going to run out of physical and social infrastructure here pretty quickly if we're going to accommodate 54 million. Water, roads, education, healthcare. How do we attract those people, maintain, as Michael says, the quality of life in Texas, but not collapse under our own weight?
We've been building, again, as if the road is straight, as if the ways that we've done it in the past, not just the past 10 or 20 years, but even the past 200 or 300 years, as if those ways will serve us in the future.
Right.
And they won't, because as I said, we're already on this curve. But this curve is happening because of many reasons. It's happening because of population growth, demographic changes, cultural and social impacts, technological advances, as well as a changing climate.
Yeah.
We have to recognize that if we want to continue to live well and even better, which I think we can, we have to do it different and smarter.
Yeah. And you know, Katharine, because you've been here a while that this is not a state that likes to spend money on things. The idea of this is a low tax, low service state, that's a feature and not a bug, right? But the problem is you have to invest in that foundation underneath all this growth.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ways in which the road curves.
Absolutely. And I would add to that, I would say people
Right.
here don't like curves in the road either.
That's right. Majora, you have the benefit of a fresh perspective not being from here. We in Texas, let me tell you, believe nothing more than our own BS about how great we are. Right? We know better. That should be, in fact, the state's motto, Texas, we know better.
I
Right?
love it.
Yeah.
At least you admit it.
We
you
admit
know?
it.
But we don't do better.
But the reality is you come from a place that has experienced its own challenges in the area of population growth and curves in the road.
Yep.
What can you tell us from your experience about the kind of trajectory that we're on?
Yeah.
What should we think about what you know that we can apply to our own situation?
Interestingly enough, even in a city that is as dense and as populated as it is in New York, you know, we still are dealing with the same kind of ideas around density, like how dense could it be? It's like,
Right.
guys, come on, like you're gonna, and the fact, I'm just so excited that you said, like, as if we can assume that the way we've been doing it for the past couple of 100 years are going to serve us, because they just won't. So the questions are really, I think, based on exactly what my esteemed colleagues just said over here, you know, which is how do we take the fact that we are moving in a particular way and doing it in a way that's much more sustainable, but acknowledges that things are changing. Our population is growing. Until we can actually convince people to stop having children the way that they are,
Right.
As a Western society, I don't see that happening. So the meantime is like, how are we using our resources and being really mindful about how that's happening, and helping to making sure that we're investing in the kind of innovation that's allowing us to use our resources really wisely and smartly. But I think the density issue is a really, really big one.
Well, you know, the big trade-off is, do you invest in the donut or do you invest in the whole? Right? If you've got a growing population in an urban environment, do you try to thoughtfully push people to the outer ring, or do you figure out how infill or creative use of space inside the donut, or in the hole, I should say.
Yeah,
of the
hole.
donut?
Yeah, I'm sorry, it took
Right.
me a second to realize what you were talking about.
It's okay, you're not alone. That's fine.
But I think that the idea, you know, it's like we're seeing it with urbanization, how, you know, older adults are kind of like, I don't want a car, I want to be able to walk to where I'm going.
Right.
You know, and they're competing with younger people who are just like, you know what, I'm going to go to this bar and I'd rather not drive on the way back. So that, I think, two kind of glaring polar opposite examples, but basically there is competition for the same type of space. And if we can actually work to create the kind of communities and cities and areas where folks do feel as though all of their needs are met,
Yeah.
and multiple people feel like their needs are met,
Yeah.
then what we have are the kind of communities that people really do feel like they don't have to move out of in order to live in a really awesome
Well,
way.
you, Majora, led us very nicely in your remarks to this point. So I mentioned population growth is a big driver, urbanization related but separate as a major driver. Texas right now, according to the census, has 3 of the 10 and 6 of the 20 largest population cities in the country, more than any other state. Houston is 4, San Antonio 7, Dallas 9, Austin 11, Fort Worth 16, El Paso 20 in population.
Wow.
We are an urban state. The fault line in Texas used to be, for so many years, rural versus urban. That battle is over, and urban won. 75% of the population of Texas today lives east of I-35.
Wow.
That is going to continue.
Wow.
So as a state that is increasingly urban, how do we think about our future? Because it's one thing to think about the future of a state. It's another thing to think about the future of an urban state. Those are not the same thing. So Majora, what do you think the difference is for us, being an urban state as opposed to simply a
Well,
state?
yeah, that's what I was thinking about,
Yeah.
because that's what shocked me the most. Is like, as big as Texas is, there are that many cities here, and like why I didn't. It's like this little secret that
It's how you
that,
get to 28
y'all have
million,
been
right? As
keeping
you have big
from
cities.
everybody, and I was just like, whoa, like this. You guys are a bunch of metropolises, like in this area. I don't think that plural was right, but anyway, forgive me.
Metropoli.
But yeah, thank you. What was it?
Metropoli?
There you go.
That's right. Yeah.
So how many people does it take to figure out a plural or not? But anywho, so I do think that looking at Texas as a profoundly urban state, that culture shift.
Yep.
And I don't know, I mean, that's a question for you all. Has Texas embraced that or not? Because I do think that that's going to be, that idea is what's going to either hold people back or may help them embrace it.
Right. And now your fellow panelist from Lubbock County, one of the areas of the state.
Number 21.
Right. One of the areas of the
there.
state that is declining in population, right? The rural areas of the state, as where you are, Katharine, are beginning to show real signs of losing people who are disappearing and not coming back. Your perspective on this, I would love to know, as the state begins to migrate more toward urban areas.
Well, and even Lubbock itself is growing very rapidly.
Yeah.
Urban areas offer both a challenge and an opportunity. So the challenge is that urban areas are uniquely vulnerable to many different types of impacts, everything from economic shocks to extreme disasters.
Yep.
But of course, as you've just highlighted, urban areas also have tremendous potential because you have so many people in the same place that density actually affords you the ability to make changes that you would not otherwise see.
Right.
So one amazing statistic I just heard was that in 30 years, we expect 95% of people in the United States to not even bother owning a car anymore.
Cool.
Right.
Yeah. Because there will just be fleets of not just regular vehicles, but I'm not joking, look this up, fleets of flying vehicles. Yes.
Right.
Imagine what Mopac will look like then.
Right.
How is it possible to achieve these type of incredible advances that are like space-age advances happening in our lifetime? It's by having that density of population.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, but of course it also strains, again, I mean, you've been so focused on climate and focused on atmosphere over time. Having all those people in a dense urban environment is not helping the atmosphere of the state. If we don't make choices to enable the atmosphere to be better and not worse, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The pollution comes in urban areas, it comes just about all from burning fossil fuels.
Right.
So in the same way that we're uniquely vulnerable to that, those 200,000 people who die from air pollution primarily live in urban areas.
Yeah.
But at the same time, weaning ourselves off old dirty ways of getting energy that we've been using since the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
The first air pollution rules were passed in the 1200s. That's how long we've been burning coal.
Right.
The penalty was death. For burning coal within the city limits of London. We have the potential to affect enormous change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Based on our behavior and,
Yeah,
and the
our
choices we
choices,
make.
exactly.
And and the Michael Weber piece of this, of course, is that all these additional people and all this density, we're going to strain the limits of our energy capacity and our power electricity capacity. In fact, we already see in Texas at key moments these rolling brownouts and blackouts, and a question of whether having an independent grid here in Texas is a good idea or a bad idea. You think about this stuff all the time.
I think about this a lot. So a lot of people don't realize there are 3 grids in America, East, West, and Texas.
And
We have our
Texas,
own
right,
grid.
right.
Yeah.
And the good news is we can experiment on a grid-sized test bed and try new things. And
Right.
we've integrated a lot of wind, for example. We have widespread rollout of smart meters. Some of the tools to clean things up, we've done at a faster pace in a lot of places because of that opportunity, that freedom to make our own decisions. At some point, we might want to connect to the other grids so we can sell our wind power and solar power to other people,
Yeah.
make money decarbonizing their grids. Although we think those grids are kind of trashy and might fall down and bring our grid down with it, so we're a little afraid. Then our grid went down in 2011, and we thought, well, maybe actually their grid looks pretty good now, so we haven't made up our mind on that. There are a lot of market forces at play there and a lot of pride. But
Yeah.
I think we do have these kind of opportunities as a state to experiment on some of the solutions at scale,
Right.
at a scale that's as large as the United Kingdom,
Yeah.
or larger than the Netherlands, other countries we consider maybe leaders or thoughtful on these issues. So we have that opportunity, and transportation is one of those. You mentioned the flying cars, and just the opportunity to not own cars means mobility services will be one of the substitutes. And we've done research at UT, and one of the researchers here, Dr. Todd Davidson, and I did a study on mobility services are actually cheaper for most people than owning a car.
Yeah.
And once you go to services away from a car, that's for urban and suburban areas, not true for rural areas.
Right.
And once you get to a point where you don't need to park a car, then you can remove a lot of parking, and that opens up 2 lanes per road. And then that means more traffic can move more smoothly. Then once you get rid of the parking garages, you can have more housing or offices downtown. And that's a way to achieve it. So transportation goes hand in hand with this. But then you have to have jobs that are appropriate for downtown, which isn't
exactly, which is
farming,
where you come in.
and it isn't factories or isn't refineries. And so there has to be some economic coupling here where we have jobs that are I don't know, creative services or financial services, things that you can do downtown. And the job mixes happen in places like Dallas and Austin, so we're very urban, and Houston as well. But if you are a city that depends on a lot of space to get your work done, then it'll be hard for you to densify. So the economic mix has to go along with the transportation mix, has to go along with these other behavioral changes.
Yeah. So we talked about population, we talked about urbanization. Majora, I wanted to talk to you about demographic change. Here in Texas, we are moving rapidly toward Hispanic majority status. We became a minority majority state in 2004. The Anglo population dropped below 50%, never to go back above. Today, we are 43% Anglo, 39% Hispanic in Texas. By 2040, not 2050, 2040, we will be, according to the demographers, 55% Hispanic, 32% Anglo. The only age group in Texas in 2040 in which Anglos will still outnumber Hispanics is 65 and older. It is, as the demographers say, basically all over for the Anglos in Texas as we head forward. So we're going to have greater concentrations of communities of color in the state of Texas, and really your experience at greening the ghetto, as you've coined that phrase and popularized that phrase, and understanding that, again, approaching a future with more communities of color rather than fewer requires different choices and a different mindset. How should we as a state, as we move toward 2040 and 2050, be thinking about the demography issue?
Really thinking about those communities where the type of community, those low status communities, which are typically low status right now, that are considered sort of like the places that are, where there's two kinds of real estate development, either gentrification straight up or poverty level economic maintenance, and recognizing that there's a third way that allows the type of economic diversity to flourish by first supporting the people that are already there who own and actually own property, and giving them opportunities to continue to be a part of the economic changes that are going to happen by supporting them to do it. Because right now, I mean, what we discover is that there's, and this isn't just here, this isn't in where I'm from, it's all over, the country. Those people who own property in low status communities are easy pickings, I think, for speculators, because they don't have the type of financial acumen, which has been traditional in this country, to not give folks of color and people in low status community access to capital, access to the kind of tools to be the developers in their own communities. If we can figure out, and I'm sure we can, because we're American and we could do all sorts of really cool things, and make it so that those communities are able to develop in place, so that the folks that are there are literally the folks that are a part of the change that's going to happen. Because change is going to happen, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, but it doesn't always have to happen from the outside coming in. It can happen from the inside coming up with the proper kind of support systems that are in place to make it happen. And, that's why we spend so much of our time focused on local economic development and the kind of real estate development that meets people right where they are, helping to keep them in the deals that we know are going to happen. And it's just it's doing the same, because the development will happen. It's not like it won't. But we're assuming that if given the proper tools, everyone will be able to actually be able to benefit, and that the folks that are in those communities will be a part of the type of change that's not just your typical gentrification or poverty level economic maintenance.
So, Katharine and Michael, as I hear, I hear Majora talk about change that happens from within the community as opposed to people swooping in, as well-intentioned as they may be, and fixing the problems of a community of color. I think about the Rio Grande Valley. I mean, really, from our perspective, that is an area of the state that is growing rapidly. It is emblematic of the demographic change that we're talking about. So, Katharine, from an atmospheric science standpoint, Michael, from an energy standpoint, how do we think about the valley's future as sort of a blocking back or a leading indicator for the rest of Texas and therefore for the rest of the country? How should we be thinking about specifically that iconic part of the state of Texas?
Well, interestingly, so, we start from the ivory tower, from academia, and interestingly, UT Rio Grande Valley is doing amazing things in terms of integrating with the community, looking at the curve in the road, figuring out how to plan for that curve from a local perspective. They aren't swooping in and bringing in external experts. They're actually doing it in the place where they live.
Ground up.
Yes, and that type of integration is so important.
Yeah. Michael, you have a similar answer on that.
University is a good place to start for some of that, to work with the community. And now you have rocket launch companies forming launch pads in the south. So the industry is actually drawn to the university as well, which becomes pretty good local employment opportunities. The colonias along the border are a part of Texas that we forget about in Austin, that this is a part of Texas that doesn't have access to piped water or electricity in many cases. We often think of that as a problem for poor people in Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, and we have that here in Texas. And it's like rural electrification that started in the 1930s didn't quite make it all the way there. So I think improving resource access would be a very important part of that. And it can't be us swooping in and just offering the answer as people who know better from the cities. But I think there's a lot of room for partnership with cities, and there's a lot of stakeholders here who care. And I think that's an opportunity. I also think about this, Majora, you just said this, we need to make sure that different groups and communities have access to property and capital. We in Texas, we have a problem of just giving certain people access to bathrooms. So that's a challenge for us.
Yeah.
So I'd like, maybe we start there and then add property and money and other things as well. Yeah.
You just gave the crowd pleaser answer on purpose. You knew that. You knew you had to do it. So I want to ask you about individuals who are not institutions like academic entities or the average person in the state of Texas, Katharine, who says, I want to be part of the solution going forward. I want to be part of building for the future. What can the average person, the civilian, member of a community do to ensure that they have a role to play in ensuring the future of the state?
I think the most important thing we can do in terms of planning for the future, voicing our concerns, recognizing what the challenges are that we face, and then making plans to face them. The most important thing we can do is talk about it.
Right.
Yes.
Because we do not talk about difficult issues.
No.
We're afraid to, because we live in a society today that is so polarized and so fragmented.
Yeah.
I hardly want to applaud for that because it's such a sad thing.
I don't know what they're cheering right now.
Hooray for polarization.
Right, yeah. People are literally petrified to have Thanksgiving dinner with the family because you don't know what you're going to talk about other than the turkey.
You've met my family, apparently, yeah.
All of our families, yes.
Right.
So talking about these issues is one of the most important things we can do. It's also one of the scariest things we can do.
Right.
But talking from the heart rather than talking from the head.
Is there a way, Katharine, to depoliticize these issues as we talk about them in communities? Part of the concern that I have is that there are very few places that, before this became a pejorative phrase, that were sort of safe spaces to have these conversations, right?
Yeah.
Where you could go and encounter people who have a different perspective than you do, and in a civil fashion, actually look for the things that you agree on rather than what you disagree on. The world today sets up these conflicts for us every place we turn. How do you depoliticize the kinds of issues we're talking about for the good of the state?
Yes. We have to depoliticize them if we're going to make any progress, because otherwise they're just going to be a casualty to the polarization that our society suffers from today.
Right.
How do we do that? We do that by going one level deeper. So rather than just bringing up the talking points that coincide with our political perspective,
Right.
rather than bringing up the hot button issues, go a level deeper and say, what is it that I really care about? And what is it that you care about too? Getting back to the way I started, what do we really care about? We care about having a safe and healthy place to live, having a place where we can get a job, we can have a home, we can raise a family. That's what we all care about. And when we start conversations from values that we share, things that we have in common, that conversation can go somewhere in a positive way. But when we start a conversation from a place of you're over here and I'm over there, that conversation typically just deepens the divide between us.
Michael, again, to you on this question of what the individual, the civilian, person who's not associated with one of these problem-solving entities, but is just a regular citizen of Texas can do to help us get to 2050 in a productive fashion.
That's such a great question. I think that there's a lot of room for just taking care of yourself and local action,
Right.
which might be clean up your yard,
Yeah.
help your neighbors with their issues, because everyone's got some sort of challenge they're dealing with. This showed up after Hurricane Harvey, by the way. Like, people did that. I'll fix my house, I'll fix my grandmother's house, I'll fix my neighbor's house. And so there's a lot of community bonding. And I think that goes a long way. And that is a great place to start. And if we all do our part and a little bit more, then we'll get there. And that will help the people who aren't positioned to take care of themselves. And as we do that, if we think about long-term shared values, like what Katharine was saying, I think we can depoliticize a lot of that. So there's a lot of argument today, but a lot of the argument's actually about what we do next. I think there's less argument about where we want to be 50 years from now. I think most people want to be in a prosperous society. Most people want to be in a free society. They want to have clean air and good water. There's a lot of agreement in the long term, but a disagreement in the near term. And so if we focus on more on the long-term shared values and start taking immediate local action where we at least take care of ourselves and help some others, I think there's a lot of progress we can make without the arguments.
Good.
So that's what I suspect.
Good. And Majora, you know, as we close here and then go to audience questions, I want to ask you the same thing, but I want to focus specifically on empowerment of individuals, because in order for individuals to play a role, they have to feel empowered to do so. They have to feel invited to do so. And it really seems from your presentation and all the work you've done that you've been all about empowering average people, civilians, to take ownership of their future. So how do we do that? What can we learn from your experience here?
The first thing I think we've done is actually acknowledge that there's a lot of fear. You know, people are just straight up fearful of losing, even if they don't have much or anything, you know, that they know what they have. And acknowledging that and then trying to inspire people to think about what a future could be if there was when they develop the capacity to dream on a future that they actually played a role in creating. That really was some of both the hardest, but I think also the most fruitful exercises that we were ever able to participate in. When you help people see beyond the fear that, you know, there's humanity literally sitting right next to you. And when you do that, it tends to help you see the humanity in yourself. And then therefore you can engage, you can engage in ways where you can feel like you can afford to be generous and open to new possibilities. And it's a really empowering way to see yourself in the world.
Well, it's a very positive answer, and we could use positive answers these days, so I'm actually so happy to hear it. So we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience. I am asked to use this app that many of you have submitted questions on, but I'm going to begin actually by asking Michael a question that was submitted to me offline earlier today, not one of mine, but somebody else's, specifically about the environment and the role that universities can play. You come from a university, as Katharine does, in modeling behavior for the rest of us. The question gets to universities leading by example on climate. The questioner points out that Southwestern University in Georgetown and the University of North Texas in Denton both generate 100% of their electricity from wind and solar, where the University of Texas, your employer, Michael, and Texas Tech, your employer, Katharine, both get less than 1% from renewables.
0.7.
Right. And so the question is, what can we do to incentivize or inspire universities like UT and Tech to take greater ownership of their own futures by relying more heavily on the kind of behavior that we should all be embracing going forward?
I think that's great. So great question. So at the University of Texas, we use natural gas to generate our power on site. We use a natural gas combined cycle power plant. And it turns out it's the most thermally efficient power plant in the entire world. So that's not bad. It is a fossil fuel, but it's very clean, efficient, and we use it efficiently on campus. We also have university lands, a couple million acres out in West Texas, a lot of oil and gas production out there historically. That's been bad from a carbon emissions perspective, but great in terms of funding public education in Texas perspective. So we get some benefits there. But the key thing about university lands is that the wind boom in Texas that started in the early 2000s started there. So it was actually university lands officials that did the first large wind farms in Texas that set the legal precedent for other wind farms, set the royalty rates for everybody else. That kickstarted the boom. So we don't power our own campus with wind, but we help kickstart this huge boom that's of global scale. So that's one of the tools in our toolbox, maybe not the main campus, but the lands. And we need to use that now for solar. There's actually very large solar farms about to be built out there, test beds for carbon capture sequestration, a lot of things we can do out there. And university land seems to be a willing partner for that. So that's
I knew you would have a specific answer to that question.
Okay.
Katharine, do you have is there a tech version of that answer?
There is, but it's still not an excuse. So at Texas Tech, we have the National Wind Institute, where they test wind turbines and battery technology. What do they do with all that wind energy that they generate and store? They put it into the regional grid that feeds my house. So that's pretty cool, but it doesn't feed the university.
Right.
And I think that that is a terrible thing, that you could actually host a national wind institute that supplies 0% of your university's power. I think it absolutely is something that should change, because we should be leading by example, especially when we have the resources, not just the financial resources, but the intellectual capacity to do so. If we have global experts, which all of our major universities do in these fields, we should be using the expertise we have to make a difference.
I think that's an excellent answer. Good. Majora, let me, back on this question of urbanization, a really good audience question here. How do we get urban farms and mass transit, and I would probably say among other things, into communities, cities that have not planned for it from the beginning? How do we essentially retrofit our urban areas to accommodate these sorts of things?
There's two different ones. So
Right.
the urban farms, I mean, as long as you're, only looking at them, because they're not so economically viable as job creators. But I do think that they're really important to let people understand their relationship to food. So that's important.
Yeah.
That absolutely, that can happen, I think, on school campuses, in individual, like institutions, whether they're health centers or community gardens, et cetera. But the mass transit thing, I mean, that's the more interesting, piece that I really want to see more of, and I think that's where we need to be looking south of the border, quite frankly. Like, some of the work that influenced me the most was the kind of work that we saw in Colombia and in Brazil, where the kind of, the kind of bus rapid transit systems and other types of mass transit were in places where they were places that had next to no money, next to no infrastructure, and they were able to do it. So we need to be looking at how they actually made it happen, and if they can do it, I get the feeling that we can too.
Right, excellent, excellent answer. Katharine, on this question of food and access to food, here's a great audience question. With the average Texan diet requiring so much water, so much energy, and other resources, how can Texans change their diets over time to ensure that we'll have adequately healthy lifestyles and adequate healthy choices?
So as an individual, one of the most important things that many of us can do to reduce both our carbon footprint as well as our resource consumption is to eat lower down the food chain. Now, many people will say, does that mean if everybody goes vegan, we can save the world? The answer to that is actually no. Because it's a very important part, for example, of our carbon footprint, but it's 24%. The rest of it is all the other things that we're talking about. And if you ever grew up in a developing country, which I did, and I actually took the bus system in Colombia, that's how I got around, and there was a million buses going everywhere. You had to memorize the colors. They were all different colors. You know that if you live in a developing country, you can't afford to be picky about where your protein comes from. You eat whatever you have. The reality here, though, is we live in a way that would require multiple planets. We've been doing a survey on our campus. Between 4 to 12 planets would be required to support the average student on our campus. And a large part of that is the food that we consume and the food that we throw away. So one of the most important things that we can focus on is our food, eating lower down the food chain. Every piece of meat you give up actually helps and makes a difference. It's also good for your budget. It's good for your heart, too. People are exploring ways to grow meat sustainably, to grow carbon-neutral meat through wise soil management, and that is possible.
Totally.
It's more expensive, but you can still get that brisket when you really need it. I think we all have a moment every year when we need that brisket.
Right.
But there are different ways that we can live that are smarter, that actually save us money, that are better for our health, and that reduce the number of planets we would need to support every person we have.
Excellent. Michael.
I want to add a little bit to that. Great comments. We do a lot of research on the energy and resource embedded in food at the University of Texas. And the food system in the United States is responsible for about 10% of our energy consumption. This is a big number. And then we throw away about a quarter to half of our edible food, which means there's more energy embedded in the food we throw away than Switzerland uses an entire year for all purposes. So these are big numbers.
Right.
So we can power entire countries with the energy embedded in the edible food we throw away, which is really amazing. So
which goes into a landfill. It isn't even reused for biofuel.
Generates climate gas. So reducing, maybe shifting your diet, but also reducing waste are big things we could do. And then because of energy abundance, energy's been affordable and abundant, we've had food abundance, which creates these weird circumstances where as a nation, we're simultaneously overfed and undernourished, which is sort of a bizarre companion. And this especially happens in urban areas. We get these food deserts where there's no access to fresh fruits or vegetables. It's only prepackaged foods, that kind of thing. So we have a lot of food issues we could solve that would be good for our public health, for our personal health, our social justice, as well as the environment. There are a lot of things that can happen simultaneously using the food system as an angle in on that.
Excellent. Let me ask, we'll do one or two more, we'll let people go back to their lives here. Although this conversation, I mean, I could sit here and talk to you guys for as long as we want to, this is great. Katharine and Michael brought up Hurricane Harvey. We're still not fully appreciating the impact that this storm is going to have on all of our lives, not only in the 22% of the state that was affected by this hurricane, but really the reverberations, the long tail of this storm will affect all of us in Texas, across the state, whether we're in an affected area or not, for a very, very long time. And an audience member is asking, as we think about the rebuild of the coast and as we think about the rebuild of the 22% of the state that was impacted by the storm, there could be, if we choose for there to be a new normal, we could simply rebuild the way that it was before, which was profoundly vulnerable to the effects of a storm like this for all the reasons that we've talked about. Or we can go for a brand new way of thinking about that part of the state. Well, again, building for the future of Texas, how should we think about the rebuild post-Harvey?
I think it's a couple of things. One of the things that inspires me about humanity is its ability to learn and improve. And then one of the things that amazes me about humanity is its willingness to not learn in many cases. So so this is a place of tension in my brain, just so you realize. And I don't think the jury's out yet on what we're going to do. And I hope we learn from what's happened and we accept this as perhaps not a once in a 1,000-year event, but heading towards new normal. And let's think about where water needs to flow. Water finds its way, whether you put something in its way or not, it'll get through. And let's give water the space it needs. And then let's think about where we're building things. Let's also think about the coastline. Texas has this unique situation where our coastline's sinking faster than the oceans are rising. So we're doubly exposed in a way that other states aren't. We pumped so much oil, gas, water out of the ground that there's been a lot of subsidence. So we're extra exposed, extra vulnerable, and that's all the things you heard earlier about the risks in Texas are special. I hope we learn, and I think a lot of it's going to come down to where the water goes. If we just need to give water its space, it'll be a lot easier for us.
I'm being told that we have time for one more, and so let me begin by asking Majora and go down the panel. A couple of different questions about the next generation. So we're all getting older, inevitably. We're going to be passing the baton to another generation of people who are going to assume leadership roles in all of our communities, take on many of these battles and fights, and have these conversations going forward. You have the opportunity to offer that generation of kids, many of them are in school right now, future leaders of this state and of this country, one bit of advice as it relates to stewardship of the future. Starting with Majora and going down, what would the one bit of advice be as we end here tonight for this next generation?
Plan for the community you live in being the only community that you'll be able to live in.
Right.
So it'll have to have everything you need in it and want in it as well.
Right, and work within that environment to make it better, as opposed to assuming that you're going to flee for some other greener space. Katharine.
Be the change, right?
Yeah.
Hope is not a passive emotion. If we want hope for the future, we have to go and look for it. How do you find hope? Not by sitting there doing nothing. We find hope by engaging ourselves, by connecting with others, by looking for hopeful stories of what other people are doing, and by contributing our own piece to that story.
Excellent.
So I'm not sure the students need my advice, because I think they're a better generation of students than my generation of students, in all honesty. And that's one of the pleasures of being a professor at UT, is I get to work with these people who are so brilliant, and it just gets more competitive, more selective every year. And this is the first generation in American history that will make less money than their parents. And they don't care, because they're not motivated by money, they're motivated by values. And I would say harness that. If your values are driving what you do instead of a pursuit of money, that's great. Stick with it and use those values, apply it locally, be the change. And they don't need our advice. I think they'll figure it out. So we need to follow them, probably.
Good. Isn't that great? I want to say what a great pleasure it is to be with Majora Carter and Katharine Hayhoe and Michael Weber now and always. Please give them a big hand for their insights tonight. And now back to Jay Bannon.